Hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Zami Tinashe Hemingway, and I am the Capacity Building Assistance or CEBA Gender Affirming Project Manager with Denver Prevention Training Center. If everyone could please change their name to the first and last name that you registered under so that we can take attendance, that would be fantastic. In addition to changing your name, if you could include your pronouns so that we can honor everyone here, that would also be appreciated. Thank you again for coming to our COP today. Welcome back, everyone. I want to briefly share more information for folks who may be joining us for the first time. As part of the Denver Prevention Training Center's CEBA funding, we are providing technical assistance in the West region to CDC directly funded community-based organizations and their clinical partners to address social determinants of health, gender affirming, and integrated services and delivery of status neutral services for transgender and gender expansive people. We work closely with 15 jurisdictions in the West to collaboratively provide services for transgender people in alignment with the Ending the HIV Epidemic Initiative. If you are not a directly funded organization, we can and will be happy to provide TA support to you as well. Email me at zami.hemingway@dhha.org for additional information, and I'll be sure to drop that in the chat for you all. Thank you again for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators, Nevaeh Anderson and Ms. Jai Smith, to begin our conversation on the Scarlet Letter, sexual stigma and hypersexualization in transgender and non-binary communities.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. First off, good day, and thank you for joining our community of practice session. My name is Nevaeh Anderson, and I'm the founder of Simply Be LLC, where I specialize in simplifying complexities around gender, race, and sexuality. I worked in HIV prevention for over a decade, and I am a transgender master trainer for the behavioral health intervention twist by way of the CDC. And I've also presented at a few national conferences speaking on the disparities of Black women of trans experience.
Thank you, Nevaeh. Hi, everyone. My name is Ms. Jai. I have a master's in public health, and I also provide capacity building and technical assistance for gender affirming care and inclusion. Additionally, I am a health and wellness educator and have worked for the past 10 years in health behavior and health promotion, developing and implementing programs and working with trans and non-binary individuals and groups to maximize our health potential. My pronouns are she and her and he and him, and I am currently living in occupied Akimel O'odham and Paipash land, or Phoenix, Arizona. For our session today, we will be talking about sexual stigma, hypersexualization, and desexualization, and how these show up in sexual health programming. So these are our learning objectives for today's COP. We plan to achieve them by first building some common language by defining sexual stigma, hypersexualization, and desexualization. Secondly, we will describe the history of hypersexualization of transgender and non-binary people and how that has informed current experiences of hypersexualization in society. Then we will describe the history of desexualization of transgender and non-binary people and how that has also informed current experiences of desexualization in society. And then finally, we will describe the ways we can reduce hypersexualization and desexualization in our sexual health programming through a group discussion and some brainstorm exercises. So to start us off, I'd like to invite folks to share some of their own definitions. So for these definitions, you can put them in the chat or you can take yourself off mute and share your definition. So first, how would you define sexual stigma?
I guess, hey, Ms. Jai.
Go ahead.
This is Ty from Denver. I would define sexual stigma as stigma that is associated with types of sexual activities that I enjoy. So it makes me feel bad or sick if I engage in certain things.
Thank you, Ty. I'm also seeing in the chat from Michael being shamed for sexuality, and from Mary feelings labeled as wrong or bad, or good or right. Thank you. So then next, what do you think of, or when you think of hypersexualization, what are some things that come to mind? So feel free to put those in the chat or take yourself off mute.
I can say that hypersexualization for me as a young woman or a young girl was very, very common. Don't dress this way, even though I hadn't even gone through puberty, because of the things that boys are going to do or others are going to do or say.
Thank you for sharing that. Other folks, what comes to mind when you hear hypersexualization?
Hi, Ms. Jai. For me, I think of young Black women and girls because young Black girls are often, so often hypersexualized, to sexualize so people think that they're older than they are or they're more experienced than they are. So that's what comes to mind because that's the first thing I thought of.
Thank you for sharing that. Some other things I'm seeing in the chat are placing uninvited focus on someone's sexuality and or appearance and or relationships, being fetishized, being seen as sexual creatures over any other qualities or having other qualities diminished, and hypersexualization impacting all gender identities, and that it varies by how someone is racialized. Thank you for sharing those. So then the final question for this portion I have for you all is, what do you think of when you hear desexualization? What comes to mind for you? So again, feel free to unmute yourself or put your responses in the chat.
So, Ms. Jai, I think of this as Ty again from Denver. I think of the eraser of sexual feelings and expressions. And I think this often happens to people who are larger bodied. Those feelings or those emotions, those desires are often erased from them.
Thank you for sharing that, Ty. In the chat, I'm also seeing erasing of our sexuality, assuming or pushing the ideology that some folks don't have the right to access sexuality, i.e. folks who are living with a disability, exclusionary dating practices that are rooted in racism, transphobia, fat phobia, ableism, assumptions that are made that a person who does not meet one's own views of sexuality, attractiveness, etc., is not sexual or not deserving of being sexual, and objectifying genitals, and so stopping objectifying genitals and bringing the whole person in. So thank you, wonderful. Thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts and your definitions and the ways that we think about this. We would like to share our definitions of sexual stigma, hypersexualization, and desexualization to ensure that we're all on the same page as we move through today's COP. And so I'm going to pass it back over to Nevaeh to give the definition for sexual stigma.
Thank you. So sexual stigma is a form of social stigma that devalues any non-heterosexual behavior, identity, relationship, or community, treating non-cisgender heterosexual men as inferior. This affects transgender and non-binary people because of their actual or perceived non-heterosexual identities. With that being said, can someone provide a few examples of sexual stigma? And if you can, please feel free to unmute yourself or place it in the chat box. Conversion therapy, Michael said that's definitely a good example. The belief that bisexual people don't exist or are hypersexual or selfish. Absolutely, thank you for that, Dylan. How does sexual stigma come into play with transgender and non-binary individuals? And yet same for polyamorous people. The assumption that all trans women in films are doing sex work, and this is from Kay Anderson. Absolutely, thank you for that. Any other ideas anybody would like to share today? And fetishization, absolutely. The assumption that non-binary people don't want to be touched. That's an interesting one. Thank you for that, Dylan. And it's funny because these are all things that we'll be covering today. So you are definitely hitting the nail on the head. And assumption that the whole concept of being down low, absolutely, Liana. And the assumption that trans women's sexuality is connected to only HIV. Absolutely, and thank you for sharing that, Jay. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and move forward. So first off, thank you for all of those responses. They're very informative. Some examples of sexual stigma will include the assumption that trans women are living with HIV, as someone mentioned earlier, because of perceived increased sexual activities or lack of participation in receptive penetrative sex. Sexual stigma can also affect sexual health programming practices by reporting inaccurate sexual activity and partner data, as well as missed opportunities for family planning, HIV and STI testing, as well as PrEP referrals. So with that being said, what are some other examples of sexual stigma faced by transgender and gender expansive communities? Please feel free to unmute yourself or place it in the chat box. So question, how do you all feel that trans and non-binary folks are perceived when it comes to sexuality? Being portrayed as sexual predators, that's an excellent one, Michael Duffy. Can you go a little bit more into that if you don't mind?
Yeah, I can speak to that. Like, it makes me think of the whole bathroom bill situation that if trans people are in a bathroom, they're in there posing a danger to someone else.
That's a primitive example, and thank you for bringing that up. Let's see what else we got in the chat box before we move forward.
I can read it for you, Nevaeh. Inappropriate questions around genitalia, sexual preferences, and practices. Another response is sexual stigma is also showing up with monkeypox messaging through media and medical institution. Then there was a +1 to the previous comment. Violence and sexual violence against trans communities is not elevated to the same concern level as violence against cis women. Trans people being portrayed as deceitful, being portrayed as promiscuous or risky sexual practices.
These are all wonderful examples. Thank you for your assistance, Ty, once again. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So when we talk about hypersexualization or the sexualization of public spaces involves the attribution by the media of a sexual character to a product or behavior that has nothing intrinsically sexual about it, or nothing particularly sexual about it. Hypersexualization involves dehumanizing a person by solely focusing on the individual's genitalia and its usage. Hypersexualization also involves focusing on perceived sexuality and sexual acts for one's own gratification or amusement. As an example of hypersexualization of transgender and non-binary individuals, this includes how outreach is conducted. Solely targeting places that are known for sex work, or solely targeting clubs and hookup apps for the purpose of recruiting transgender non-binary individuals to your agency's sexual health programming, focuses on perceived stereotypes of how and where transgender and non-binary individuals are engaging in sex. Although this type of outreach would be ideal, as transgender and non-binary individuals are more than likely to engage in sex work, there should never be a notion that all transgender and non-binary individuals engage in sex work. We also cannot assume that all transgender and non-binary individuals are more than likely to be promiscuous or engage in behaviors that are deemed risky. Additionally, this misses those transgender and non-binary individuals who do not frequent either the places that are known for hookups, or are not sex workers, or are not on hookup apps. With that being said, what are some other examples of hypersexualization faced by transgender and non-binary individuals? Please feel free to take yourself off the mute or place it in the chat box. So Jericho actually came up with one saying transmasculine men are fetishized by cis gay men. And Kay Anderson definitely agrees. Questions like, but what's in your pants, focusing on genitalia, absolutely. Which we go into, but usually that takes the humanity out of going with trans and non-binary individuals. Let's see. How about in the media? How does that tend to show up? And then of course, Miana agreed, said invasive questions. So the one thing for me that kind of pops up is whenever we talk about trans representation, at least as a collective, meaning amongst cisgender individuals, there's this notion that the kids are being sexualized when it has absolutely nothing to do with sexuality. So that's one that I definitely think of. And the majority of narratives in the media about T, G, and B folks, highlighting folks doing sex work, absolutely. And the assumptions that trans and non-binary folks are into non-normative and perverse sexual activities. Those are definitely their responses. Thank you, Zami and Michael. Okay, if that's all we have, I would like to thank you all for those additional examples. And I'm going to go ahead and pass back to Ms. Jai.
Thank you for going through those definitions for us, Nevaeh. So in contrast to hypersexualization, desexualization is the process in which sexuality is removed from an identity, an interaction, a setting, or a discourse or conversation. So this can be by the individual themselves. So for example, a trans man choosing not to disclose enjoying sexual activity with partners for fear of being denied other gender affirming procedures or services. This can also be enacted by a law, a policy, or by social norms. So for example, a trans woman being desexualized in gay cis male spaces and treated as asexual caregivers or nurturers instead, or in some instances, performers as well instead. So when we talk about desexualization in sexual health programming for transgender and non-binary people, we are talking about the ways that trans people's sexuality and desirability is erased or sterilized to the detriment of providing services. So for today's COP, we are going to focus on hypersexualization first, what it looks like and how it affects transgender and non-binary clients getting their sexual health needs met. Next, we will explore desexualization and how this also affects getting sexual health needs met. And then we will move into more of the brainstorms as well. But before we move on, what questions do you have about these definitions of sexual stigma, hypersexualization, and desexualization? Feel free to unmute yourself or put your questions in the chat. And if you don't have a question, if you can just put a 1 in the chat so I know that you're good to move forward. Awesome, seeing lots of 1s. Oh, here's a question. I'm interested in how this contributes to interpersonal violence in LGBTQ relationships. So we will be talking from the perspective of when it's in the place of sexual health programming. But I think that that's a great point to bring up, is that sexual health programming oftentimes is thinking about the partners and the relationships that are present. And we won't really be getting much into the interpersonal violence aspect, but I think that's an important conversation to have, and how sexual stigma can contribute to that as well. All right, thank you all. So I'm going to hand it back over to Nevaeh to discuss the history of trans and non-binary hypersexualization.
Thank you. So I have a question for you all, and please feel free to take yourself off of mute or put it in the chat box. But what do you all know about Sarah Bartman's story? Is anyone familiar with Sarah Bartman? And if you are, how familiar are you with her? Okay, so Mary said, no, I'm not. That's okay. Okay, so it looks like it's universal. Oh, well, Kay Anderson said that, she's known as a Hottentot Venus. So that's definitely one. Do you know how she got that name? Abigail stated she know from the freak show lore, which definitely is a part of it. So absolutely. All right, thank you all for that. So it sounds like as a collective, a lot of folks aren't familiar with the story of Sarah Bartman. So I'll go ahead and get into that story. So Sarah Bartman, who is also known as the Hottentot Venus, is a cisgender Black African woman. She was born in 1789 under the name Sahura, and she resided in South Africa's Gamtoos Valley until she was sold into slavery to a trader named Peter William Cesar, who would rename her Sartarji. Bartman was initially sent to Cape Town, South Africa to be a servant, but was later sold to William Dunlop and taken to London. And in London, Bartman was used as a main attraction by Dunlop in freak shows, displaying her half-naked body for pay and charging an additional fee for spectators to touch her. Eventually, Bartman would spend her later years in France, living out her last days as a sex worker. And Bartman died in 1815. And after her death, her body was immediately casted for CoP, and her brains and genitals were removed and placed in Musée de la Homs, a museum in Paris until 1974. In August of 2002, her remains were returned to South Africa for proper burial. Her body was memorialized because after 200 years of being exploited and sexualized for profit against her will, it was important, especially to her home country, to honor her after being treated and displayed in such a grotesque way. How does the story of Sarah Bartman connect to the hypersexualization of transgender and non-binary individuals? Please feel free to take yourself off of mute or place it in the chat. She had no choice even after death, absolutely.
Hi, Nevaeh.
Hi.
Just from what, actually, I just learned about this yesterday, actually in the meeting through Ty and through Zami, but because, and that's the whole thing I think with when I was about Black women and girls, because of many of the shapes of their bodies, and because she was very full figured and she didn't look like, she didn't look like white women or white counterparts, that people thought that she was a freak or just over sexualized, or thought she was just, something other than, and that this was, I just heard about this, and I'm embarrassed to say I've never heard of this, but her, and it is just, I had so many feelings when I first heard the story yesterday.
Absolutely.
So it's pretty incredible.
Absolutely. And Lisa, if it makes you feel any better, I found out about her story through Facebook, and I just did a little bit more digging. Unfortunately, that's what happened with a lot of Black stories, right? Like, we don't hear about them for a while and they just start to resurface. So totally understand. Let's see what was said in the chat box before we move forward. So again, Jericho stated she had no choice even after death. Michael said was seen as a divergence from some white-centric norm, especially for women and AFAB people, especially the assumptions about what women in AFAB bodies should look like. Thank you for that. And I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything.
Hey, Nevaeh, I just wanted to add, so this is Zami from Denver PTC. Just want to add that also for trans and non-binary bodies, there's a hyper focus or obsession with, genitalia, what our bodies look like pre-post surgery. And oftentimes when in the medical field, when providers, researchers, et cetera, are talking about trans and non-binary bodies, is through this hyper focus on genitalia, how they differ from cisgender bodies, et cetera, and as opposed to looking at trans folks as a whole person. So similar to how people looked at Sarah Bartman as an object and just hyper focused on her body, that also happens for trans and non-binary people today. So just bringing it back to the question of how it reflects or mirrors what the community experiences.
Thank you so much for that. And then we'll take this last one and we'll go ahead and move forward. So Michael also said the lack of privacy and that of our bodies are available for consumption and entertainment for others. Absolutely. So why is the story of Sarah Bartman relevant to the hypersexualization of trans and non-binary individuals? And we did touch on a few topics, but let's go ahead and explore that a little bit more. If we go back to some examples we provided earlier, we see the connection between hypersexualization of Bartman and the experiences of trans and non-binary individuals, and they're eerily similar. Hypersexualization of transgender women is rooted in establishing a clear power dynamic, specifically subjecting transgender women to cissex power. Per Nzani's 2021 article, Fetishization and Sexualization of Transgender and Non-Binary Individuals, in 2007, Julia Serrano published Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoat of femininity. And it highlights how transgender women are objectified during their transition journey. Serrano goes into detail on how transgender women are sexualized, whether it be catcalling or being treated as sexual objects in the media, to the fetishization of transgender women in pornography, which views the transgender woman as a consumable sex experience. Serrano also points out that there is a misconception that transgender women transition for the approval and sexual desire of cisgender heterosexual men. In fact, experiences with cisgender heterosexual men can result in being subjected to overt sexualized interactions, including strangers starting unprompted conversations with transgender women that are about sexual desires and fantasies. Further, there's also a belief that transgender women undergo gender reassignment surgery solely to be receptive sexual partners for cisgender men, which perpetuates norms of sexualized violence and blaming transgender women because they quote unquote had it coming, while also relinquishing cisgender men of accountability of their actions. As a result of this hypersexualization, transgender women's values is reduced to a sexual object to be consumed. Azani's article also stated that transmasculine and AFAB non-binary individuals are also subjected to hypersexualization by way of reducing a person to the genitals. In a study of experiences of hypersexualization, one participant recalled receiving messages from self-identified straight men to meet up for sex, while another stated that bi-curious and closeted men fetishized transmasculine and AFAB individuals because they felt it was a safe way to engage in sexual intercourse with another man without compromising their heterosexuality. Additionally, Transmasculine and non-binary individuals have reported experiences of having their gender identity ignored and being hypersexualized, both by cisgender men who identify as either heterosexual or bicurious, and cisgender lesbian women. And from the pictures, from left to right, Caroline Cossey was a model as well as a Bond girl who was outed in the media. When she was outed, her story was sensationalized. The Bond girl was a boy, as you can see, et cetera, et cetera. T.S. Madison is a former adult entertainer and sex worker who eventually turned into a online personality as well as a TV personality. And Buck Angel is an adult entertainer, a transmasculine adult entertainer, and he's also an activist as well. Next slide, please. Language specifically used to hypersexualize transgender and non-binary individuals often result in removing the humanity from the person. Like Bartman, a lot of transgender and non-binary individuals are viewed as a curiosity and reduced to the genitals. Words like transvestite and tranny were often used to medicalize or to categorize transgender people as abnormal or sexual oddities. Whereas words like she-male or he-she reduce the individual to their genitals and are often accompanied by perverse imagery of transgender and non-binary individuals. To know more, you can go to the Google images and type in transgender woman, transvestite, and tranny for a visual example of hypersexualization. I do warn you that the visuals that come are explicit in nature, so needless to say, they're not safe for work. Here are a few quotes from individuals who have experienced hypersexualization. One stated, having a man constantly talk about my penis and how great it is while I was naked, and the final instance is the only case in which I was working as a sex worker. This came from a white, non-binary transgender woman who identified as a lesbian, and this was recorded by Nzani in 2021. Another quote that was recorded by Nzani in 2021 is, I felt fetishized in a variety of ways, but especially by bicurious or closeted men who review transgender men as either a safe way to engage in sex with another man, while still retaining some plausible deniability, their claim to heterosexuality as well, as a way to fulfill a fantasy of having sex with a lesbian, or as a way to deny their own non-heterosexual attraction. I have even been pursued by men who felt that as a non-T post-top surgery transgender man, I was similar to a prepubescent boy, excuse me, and they found this attractive. Another quote by Azani is, I have repeatedly had to block strangers and mutual friends on social messages for messages like, I bet the right dick could cure you, excuse the language, or give me an hour, I can make you a real woman. One creepy old guy referred to me as a reasonable substitute for gay pedophiles. And the last one, this was a quote by Hysteria in 2020. Fetishization is an invasion of my boundaries because I used to, and still do occasionally, get spam with nude photos of men, despite my profile explicitly stating that men weren't to send me nudes out of respect. It kind of brought home for me that trans women, especially Black and Indigenous trans women, aren't considered marriage material, just mistresses to be hidden away. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Ms. Jen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nevaeh, and thank you for sharing those quotes from folks. We're going to be moving into desexualization, but before we do, are there any thoughts or questions around what we covered in hypersexualization? Please feel free to put those in the chat or to take yourself off mute. And if no one has anything additional to add or no questions, if you can just put a 1 in the chat so that I can see that we're all ready to move to desexualization. Awesome, thank you everyone. So if we think of if we think of hypersexualization as one end of the sexual stigma spectrum, we can think of desexualization as the other. So desexualization of transgender and non-binary people comes from external perceptions of what it means to engage sexually with a transgender person. So for example, a cisgender man having sex with a transgender woman, the belief that that must mean that the cisgender man is gay, which again focuses on genitalia and not the sexual and gender identity of the transgender person. It removes that sexual identity from the transgender person. Additionally, desexualization comes from misbeliefs that someone's sexuality must align with their gender in a way that allows for easy gay, straight categories, and that non-heterosexual identities are inferior or to heterosexual identities or stigmatized. We see this in the way that Lou Sullivan was treated, or rather how Lou Sullivan was not treated. So Lou Sullivan was an openly gay trans man living in San Francisco in the 70s and 80s. Because Lou identified as a gay man, he had difficulty finding physicians willing to provide gender-affirming care. The belief was that because Lou enjoyed engaging sexually with cisgender men, that he could continue living his life as a heterosexual cisgender woman. In this way, his sexuality was invalidated and his gender identity was invalidated through the provider's belief on how a transgender man's sexuality should be. He was specifically denied services because, from the physician's perspective, it did not make sense to provide affirming surgery to allow him to live as a gay man. So where does this belief come from? This comes from a historical context of trans men's sexual functioning and relationship building. Henry Benjamin developed the sexual orientation scale in his 1966 publication, The Transsexual Phenomenon. In this publication, diagnostics for what made a true transsexual was based on the Kinsey scale, specifically a Kinsey 4 through 6, or inclined towards same gender loving. Further, he went on to describe sexual behavior for trans men as only being pleasurable and real with cisgender women, and that any sexual activity with cisgender men was unpleasant and that penetration was never wanted. This was based off of interviews with 20 trans men, so a small sample size, and had large implications on the ways that trans men were understood in sexual and relationship health. This led to an assumption that trans men are only engaging sexually with cisgender women, and that transition for a trans man was to assume a heterosexual identity and recloset into a heterosexual relationship. This assumption then leads to sexual health programming for gay and bisexual men that is absent of the sexual health and reproductive health needs of transgender men and non-binary AFAB folks. As I mentioned before, the desexualization of trans women can look like isolating trans women to roles of asexual nurturers or caregivers in cisgender gay male spaces. But additionally, desexualization of trans women can occur through the removal of their sexual orientation. And we see this happen for lesbian trans women who are often reduced to their genitals again and framed as heterosexual cisgender men who are trying to fool cisgender lesbian women into sexual relationships. From these examples, we see the three different ways that transgender and non-binary people are desexualized. The first is through attempting to rewrite a person's sexual orientation. So for example, you're not a gay trans man, you're a heterosexual cisgender woman. The second is through framing an individual's sexual orientation as a way to fool partners into having sex. So you're not a lesbian trans woman, you're a heterosexual cisgender man. And then the third, as mentioned before, is by reducing transgender people to asexual beings without sexual desire or interest. Here are two quotes underscoring how the removal of an individual's sexual orientation can have negative outcomes for sexual health programming. The first quote is from the story of Nick Laird and his partner, Mark. So Nick is a trans man who is in a relationship with a cisgender man who he has a happy sex life. However, Nick believes that in order to get prescribed hormone replacement therapy, he has to express some persistent discomfort with his genitals. So quote, "I even had to lie to doctors to get prescribed testosterone, or at least I felt that I had to lie because I was scared. They would not prescribe testosterone, which I desperately wanted to take. I pretended to want phalloplasty because I knew they could accept I was a man without a penis, but they could not accept me as a man who did not want one. I felt I had to want one. In this quote, Nick is sharing his belief that in order to receive access to medically prescribed testosterone, he has to fit a narrative of experiencing discomfort or disgust for a part of his body where he actually experiences a lot of pleasure with his partner. In effect, he is omitting parts of his sexual self or desexualizing himself out of fear that he will otherwise not be able to receive the treatment that he wants. In the second quote from the United States Transgender Survey from 2015, a participant expresses challenges with accessing HIV testing services. So, quote, "The nurse refused to give me HIV testing because she said those funds were reserved for men who have sex with men, and I'm not a real man. She told me I was born female and just needed to accept reality." This second quote shows another side of desexualization as we have been discussing it, which is the refusal of services because of the remolding of identity and sexual activity based on perceptions that sexuality must align with gender identity in very specific ways. Despite the person identifying as a man and seeking HIV testing for men who have sex with men, they are being perceived and recategorized as a heterosexual cisgender woman. This also provides us with an example of how we should consider how we set up service delivery, including who will be denied services based on agency policy, and how that will in turn impact perception of the agency. So after hearing how trans and non-binary people experience desexualization in our society and in our programs, I'd like to hear your thoughts on desexualization. So how additionally, or how does desexualization show up in sexual health programming? Please feel free to unmute yourself or put your responses in the chat.
Hey, Miss Jai, I'll chime in. So I really appreciated this piece because I'm thinking about when I was a HIV tester in particular, and how the categories at the agency that I worked for at the time really did focus on trans women and providing services to trans women, cisgender men, and then cisgender women, if they were injection drug users, were our priority. But when it came to trans men or AFAB folks, a lot of the conversation was, well, they're not a priority population, so we're not focusing on getting testing to that demographic. And so just really thinking about how now we see this trend in HIV testing, but also just needing more access to PrEP services, et cetera, and how there's a large part of the transgender and non-binary community that does not get outreach to provide these services. And so really thinking about how you said it really stems from desexualization, and even the conversation around, in order for trans men to transition, it had to be under the guise of going back into the closet and being a cisgender or being a straight man, essentially. So I really appreciated everything that you brought up and the nuances there.
Yeah, thank you, Zami. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. Some additional things we're seeing in the chat are documenting trans women as MSM and really like miscategorizing people, right? So making assumptions about their sexual orientation, making assumptions about the gender of their partners, or just missing gender identity altogether in documentation, for sure. Challenges with electronic medical records to adequately list gender, orientation, etc. Often it's not done well, meaning people's identities are not reflected accurately in their medical chart. Absolutely. Lots of +1s on what Zami said, and data reported out often doesn't tease out trans folks. Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we see across programs as well, where information is just not collected accurately. And when we don't collect that information accurately, then we can't provide, it's harder for us to provide health services to the communities that we're actually serving. And Nevaeh shares being uncomfortable talking about gender diverse sexuality compared to cisgender sexuality. Absolutely. Or omitting portions of conversations. So not talking about fertility, for example, because of assumptions that trans people are not interested in conceiving or potentially engaging with folks where conception can take place. So thank you all for those thoughts on how this can show up in sexual health programming. Additionally, we, and some of these things we've already talked about, but we see this show up as assuming what sexual organs a person has and therefore what sexual health services are needed, and avoiding questions that would actually be necessary for sexual health assessment. So this could be, and this happens not only for trans folks, but for cisgender people as well, the assumption that organs are present and what the health needs for that individual look like. There's also assumptions on sexual behaviors and who the person is having sex with, and then assuming that they are either low risk or high risk for HIV, STIs, or pregnancy. And so then marketing services based off of those assumptions of low risk and high risk. And then believing that when people self-report low risk factors for an STI, that they must be lying about their sexual activity or identity. So this also gets into a piece of not trusting folks around their being experts in their own sexual health and their own sexuality as well. So for example, when a trans woman discloses having cisgender female partners, but is HIV positive, often the assumption is made that they are lying about their sexual orientation, and are actually having sex with cisgender men as well. And I appreciate that Zami brought up earlier HIV testing. I started my career in HIV testing and prevention services, and oftentimes the collection of data was based off of the assumption of the person sitting in front of you and how they were perceived as well. So there were lots of times that data was collected on an individual testing level based on the perception of this person is transgender or this person is cisgender sitting in front of me. But the result of that is then we have surveillance data at the local, state, and national level that doesn't accurately reflect the communities that we're serving or the actual health needs of the trans and non-binary community. We also see the desexualization by focusing on trans and non-binary communities' sexual health as strictly a vector for illness, as a way to discuss the necessity for sexual health programming, as opposed to discussing things like sexual autonomy, pleasure, and other motivators for engaging in prevention and treatment. So this could look like only focusing on HIV prevention as opposed to looking at the other reasons why someone might engage sexually and discussing things like sexual pleasure, autonomy, negotiating with partners, things of that nature. And then finally, we see this as outright refusal, as was shared in the second quote, or omission of sexual health services that would be applicable to the sexual health needs of the individual. Or we see inconsistent or non-existent fertility and reproductive health counseling with trans patients because of assumptions of sexual partners as well. I'm going to pass it back over to Nevaeh for the next portion of our discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. J. So our first question we'd like to explore with you all is this: what can we do in our sexual health programs to reduce hypersexualization? Please feel free to share your responses either by unmuting yourself or placing it in the chat box. So with what you all learned so far, what are a few things that you would feel like you would have to either re-examine or reevaluate?
I can chime in, Nevaeh. One of the things that comes to mind first for me is when we're creating programs for trans folks, they're almost always focused on reducing infection. And so creating programs in collaboration with the community around what their health concerns and health needs are that don't just focus on sexual health, but holistic health.
Absolutely, thank you for that.
I want to go back to the question that someone had asked when you all went over the definitions. And so someone had asked about how hypersexualization and desexualization impacts intimate partner relationships. And so, that's a piece of it as well. So we know that intimate partner or DV education should be integrated in sexual health programming. And so helping folks learn about not only just consent and what brings you pleasure, but how to negotiate, what are flags when you of a potential DV or IPV situation within relationships, and how sexual health programming can be a path for people to really learn what their boundaries are in relationship, and how understanding your boundaries and being able to engage in conversations with consent and pleasure can lead to more pleasurable experiences in your relationship and your sexual health.
Absolutely. Thank you for that example, Zami. Thank you all for your responses. I'm going to go ahead for the respective time and move forward. Along with the solution-oriented ideas that were mentioned, hypersexualization and sexual stigma can be reduced in the following ways. We can reduce sexual health programming advertisement tools that are sexual in nature. So for example, using hypersexual images for PrEP and testing flyers, as well as only conventionally attractive individuals conducting outreach at nightclubs and Pride events. And we can also ensure that during Pride sessions, a diverse group of people are representing your agency's sexual health programming. And they're not solely individuals who are deemed conventionally attractive. And we can also refrain from mentioning genitals unless it's absolutely necessary. We can reevaluate and move away from the term risk, and instead focus on individuals' behaviors and needs around sexual health programming. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Jai. Thank you.
Thank you, Nevaeh. Those are some great suggestions on how to reduce hypersexualization. Our next question is, what can we do in our sexual health programs to reduce desexualization? So any thoughts you have on how our programs could potentially change to reduce desexualization? Feel free to unmute yourself or place those responses in the chat. So I see normalized sex positivity, all for that.
Really
Putting
read
myself back
about.
on mute. Sorry. Hey, Nevaeh. I don't know if this is a good example, but I know that I live in New York, and monkeypox is there's a lot of focus on monkeypox, and just the messaging is just all wrong. And the messaging with monkeypox, especially in New York, has been so stigmatizing to this community that there's already been some bad events that have happened just because of the messaging. When we talk about sexual health, we need to get that right, because monkeypox is not sexually transmitted, but and just the way that it's being messaged, so I think we have to watch that, because people hear certain things, and it has to be explained better than it is.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's several in the chat that we want to also draw out. So less targeting populations based on binary assumptions. So thank you for that. Yeah, so less targeting populations assuming that trans femme folks are only engaging in one way and trans masculine folks are only engaging in one way, creating programs that allow us to expand that for us, right? Reducing the presence of police and security officers that often prevent trans folks from even entering facilities because their clothing and appearance is hypersexualized, related to the previous question. Yeah, that's a really good point. How are we developing our programs and our spaces that could inherently be off-putting or dangerous for trans and non-binary people? Decentering abstinence-only education. Yeah, so there's lots of ways that we might choose to engage sexually and relationship-wise with people in our lives. And abstinence is one portion of that. So folks may choose to not engage sexually with others, but it is not the be all end all, right? And then making sure that the education is based in inclusivity and basic safety for all, rather than making it a taboo conversation about demographics-based demographic-based sex scares. Yeah, we as trans and non-binary people, we are more than just a vector for disease. We are more than just a risk factor. And even the ways that we ask about, for example, like HIV testing or sexual health assessments, folks are asked if they've engaged sexually with a transgender person. And then that is considered a risk factor for HIV. So the ways that we're also categorizing identity as being in and of itself a risk factor is a challenge. Increase the discussions of pleasure and safety in sexual health programming. Absolutely. There's lots of ways that and reasons that we engage in sexual activity. And so it's important for us to recognize like what are some of the benefits of the ways that we engage as well and why we engage. And then there was a question that came up that says, do you think that monkeypox has stigma embedded in people's mind from messaging? How do we create change? Is changing messaging going to be effective? I think that's a great question that we don't really have time to get into for today, because I think we could have a whole presentation on the messaging that's around monkeypox and how we're seeing the stigma around sexual activity and who's being categorized as being at risk for monkeypox, what that's looking like in our communities right now. So I want to thank you all for sharing your ideas on how we can reduce desexualization in our sexual health programs. And additionally, here are some additional ways that we can look at reducing desexualization. So we can acknowledge a client's sexual identity and orientation by standardizing a way for asking for sexual identity and orientation. Just because someone discloses that they're only engaging sexually with cis men does not mean that they are of a certain sexual orientation. So instead we can just ask people their sexual orientation and identity. We can ask permission to discuss sexual pleasure and sexual health needs instead of launching into a sexual health assessment or assuming that because a client hasn't brought it up that they are uninterested in discussing it further. It might just be that they're nervous to discuss it or don't know if you're a safe person to discuss it with. Further, we can provide opportunities to discuss sexual pleasure and sexual needs by asking at every visit and leaving the door open for conversations in the future. So if someone's not ready to talk about it now, it doesn't mean that they won't be interested in the future. We can discuss sexual pleasure as part of a healthy sexual experience and as a reason for engaging in sexual health services. So for example, when we have an infection, sexual pleasure can be diminished, but having that infection treated increases sexual pleasure. We can also discuss sexual health options along a spectrum of how folks are transitioning if they are transitioning. So including focusing on sexual health as it relates to increasing gender euphoria, negotiating consent, and maximizing our sexual pleasure. And then finally, we can treat the client as an expert in their own sexual health, gender, and sexual identity and experiences. So with that, I want to thank you all for the time that we have spent together today and our conversations on some pretty heady topics: sexual stigma, hypersexualization, and desexualization. I'm going to go ahead and kick it back over to Zami to wrap us up today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ms. Jai and Avea. If you all loved that COP and that discussion, let's get some hearts, some celebration, some thumbs up. That was so beautiful. Thank you all so much. So again, thank you all for being here today. Our next session is called I Am the Body Beautiful, Body Positivity and Sexual Health Programming. We're going to continue to talk about sexual health, stigma, the body, and being more inclusive to transgender and non-binary folks. We will have the save the date out to you all shortly. Also, everyone will be receiving an email by 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time with a link to a survey. Please complete the survey. We love your feedback, and that really does help us learn how to shift programming and these conversations to be focused on what you all really want to know. And for TA requests, remember to contact me, Zami, at zami.hemingway@dhha.org, or do a request through CTS. Thank you all and see you next month.
Thank you.